Osrith looked out to the receding sea. She needed to get away from here, from the princes, no matter how well Domhnall treated her, or how happy she was within the company of the other warriors. She turned and began to stride back towards Tara, fury with herself at her own stupidity, angry steps thrusting her frustration out on the sand and rock as she went. Why hadn't she made a better plan? Why hadn't she remained at Dunnottar? She would have been on the same isle as Wessex, and would just need to find passage south, or walk. Here, she had to cross the sea. Heading towards her tent, she could begin by taking off the stupid dress. Never again would she wear one. She could fight her way to Wessex, sword or no. The festival was still underway. As she climbed up to the fields, laughter and enjoyment was coming from every area as people ate and drank, as they sang and danced. The tent was just ahead of her, but Osrith's attention was caught the clashing of swords. A fight? Had people become so inebriated? She crouched down beside a cart, on which several barrels of beer still lay, and watched and listened. The fighting was intensive, few pauses between the sword strikes. Had rival royals, or servants, got into an argument? Over the ground she crawled, listening, and stood up when she heard the owling and eyeing of the crowd. Were they encouraging the fight? Yes, in their way, Osrith saw, for it was not a battle in anger, but some sort of competition. She could just work out what the host was saying, and she crept further forward, arriving at the back of the hot, animated crowd. And so, Bryn of Mai keeps the ring, while his opponent, Gerard of Airgila, retires. A man pushed through the crowd, as annoyed as Osrith felt, pushing past people roughly. She shuffled further forward. What was going on? And, now, who will be the next man to fight Bryn and hold the circle? Osrith strained forward. At the other side of the circle, she was certain that she could see Tadg and Fergus, but neither of them moved. The end of the fight sounded decisive, so whoever fought Bryn, a large, dark-haired man holding his sword aloft, would have to be very nimble and very strong. Remember, the last person to hold the sickle will win this lovely, Frankish sword. The old man who was hosting the competition held it aloft, withdrawing halfway so the swirls and patterns could be seen. It was not Feda's sword, but it would do. As her sword. As if in a dream, Osrith shouldered past the men and strode over to the host, who bent his silver head down to her. Could she do it? She had seen little of Bryn's technique or any of his opponents. But anger at the heathen woman laughing at her and feeling ashamed of using the Gales drove her forward. Who do you represent? The man asked lazily, looking past her for the man she represented. Osrith. Osrit. He peered down at her and growled, Osrit what? Osrith thought for a moment. Lackland. Then, announced the man, may your master Osrit step forward. He was still looking past her. There was a shuffling in the crowd as they waited for the next fight. I am to fight. She reached out for the sword with which to battle Bryn. When he looked down at her, doubtfully, she insisted, I am a warrior. The old man ogled her breasts. You look like a servant girl who deserves a good ploughing. But Osrith was too furious to accept insults. She leaned across the table and put her hands on the sword hilt. The man slammed down the scabbard with the palm of his hand. And, you look like an old man who deserves his guts torn out for the grouse. Her anger poured out of her. Osrith was ready for a fight, ready to prove to herself that she was no servant. It had been over a year since she had truly fought in a battle. And now, as the man raised his hand from it, holding it out for the silver piece fee, she now faced a brute of a man who would kill her over a sword. But she didn't care. She needed that sword, she needed passage. Her one remaining piece would have to suffice. Bryn stood a little away from the table, tapping his foot impatiently. When he saw an adolescent girl in a tight-fitting dress stride towards him, he burst into fits of laughter, digging the other challenging sword into the earth to lean on. It was a mistake. Already, Osrith was lunging at him with the light sword, its flexibility almost making it qualify as a sword, if the purpose of such a weapon was to cut and slice. This first attack caught Bryn off guard and he struggled to get the sword from the earth to parry her blows. He ducked to one side, skilled feet keeping him anchored as he pivoted around. Tightening his grip on his sword, Bryn approached Osrith, who shuffled, shifting to keep Bryn in front of her as skulls at the back of the crowd broke out, inaudible to Osrith as she focused with her anger on the man. He held himself with an air of arrogance, grinning wickedly at Osrith, assured in the superiority of his sex. He reached far out to her, trying to slice down at her, but Osrith slinked back. He just wants to show off, Osrith thought to herself. He thinks this will be easy because I am a girl. He does not know that less than 2 years ago I fought a Norse army in Scotland. Yet her body felt strange, almost as if it was not her own as she dodged the next 3 attacks, all of them designed to try to scare her, none with any power or skill, and it took her concentration to move as she wanted to use his energy, to attack when his muscles began to labor. She continued to drift around the man, maintaining the same distance and letting the tip of the sword within inches of her body. That was good, she told herself, as one swipe came a little too close, the crowd gasping in lurid fascination. He will get more confident, more lazy. The setting sun cast long shadows onto the grass, and Osrith focused on her feet, making sure she could dodge more accurately as the blade of her opponent skimmed her forearm, drawing a red line on the sleeve of her dress. Then, unexpectedly, Bryn sprang towards her, lashing out with his flimsy blade towards Osrith's neck. It was a cunning strike, and as the blade darted towards her, Osrith dived to the floor, one of the first moves taught to her by Saenid. The crowd, now swelling in number as news of a girl fighting a man spread around Tara's fields, and 2 voices, from different sides of the makeshift arena, called her name. Osrith heard neither as the dive aimed at the man's feet. Bryn of Myth was too heavy to tackle to the ground, but Osrith squeezed tightly around the man's wide calves and drove her modest weight behind it. It was enough. Unsteadied, the man stumbled, and Osrith slammed the pommel of the sword against the man's bicep of his fighting arm, blocking a weak lunge as she did so that was aimed for his stomach. Instead, it glanced off her hip. Pain irradiated around this new blow, but Osrith ignored it, pulling herself up and blocking a passing blow from Bryn's sword before it could even be fully extended. "Steady," called out the owner of the competition. "His master does not want him killed, nor yours." "I have no master," Osrith growled, but her words were lost in the cheering. She raised her arm to her face, wiping away the blood. She was a warrior. This man would be defeated. Osrith then took full advantage of the man's insecure footing, for his blow had made him fall back unsteadily. She aimed hard at the base of his ribcage, not hard enough to pierce his leather jerkin but enough to wind him. "Do you yield?" Osrith shouted, stuttering the words as a trickle of blood from the man's trailing arm caught her at the side of the head. She had bitten her own lip and was lucky not to have bitten into her own tongue. Bryn staggering around her, gasping for breath, and could not answer. Not in words. He must have wanted the sword badly to not yield, to not look so ungainly in his attack against a woman, not caring for his reputation. So, it was a battle of wills, who wanted that sword more. Osrith had the upper hand, and she was to choose the next move. She chose badly. Striking out, Osrith's opponent moved his left hand, grabbing her own blooded forearm. The pain was enough for Osrith to do her own ungainly dance, and, as she did so, Bryn's right came up, his blade slashing towards Osrith's neck. She leaned back, avoiding most of the stroke. But not all of it. The blade ripped across her clavicle, gouging flesh from her body. Blood soaked into the fabric of the beautiful dress Muir had given to her, and part of Osrith's mind was given over to regret that it was now ruined. She faltered, as Bryn got the advantage. He slammed his fist into her stomach, but Osrith managed to reel back, avoiding most of the power. Her shoulder was throbbing insistently, and she fought herself to her feet. Behind her, the man holding the contest, moved from lazy spectator to actively shouting at them both to stop, horrified at the extent of the battle that suggested that neither opponent was going to give ground and may actually end up in the death of one of them. He was even more vociferous when he saw nobles striding out towards him. But neither opponent cared to stop, if they had heard him. Stabbing forward with her right arm, Osrith drove her sword into the man's left armpit, putting as much strength as she could into the attack. The man bellowed, and struck out with his own sword, but it was inaccurate and his arm flailed around. About them, the crowd drew their circle closer, most cheering but some shouting their disapproval. If Osrith had looked up then, she would have seen two Uineel, standing just behind the competition instigator. But she didn't and instead raised her sword, amateurishly, the pommel into hands, exposing her chest, ready to strike down. The man was in too much pain to take advantage of Osrith's mistake, but tangled his leg around her ankles. Os stumbled, dropping her sword, but the man was in agony from a chest wound and again could not capitalize on her disadvantage. Yield. Osrith's words were agid, but she shouted them at Bryn of Maya's face. The Uineel prince bent to the stall man's ear, look of horror on his face, and ran waving at the two warriors, waving his arms and shouting for them to stop. He does. The terrified man shouted back. He does yield. But the man did not. Again, he kicked out, and Osrith stumbled, the man's hand chancing on her dropped sword. A smile of triumph crossed his face as Osrith fell on top of him, grabbing a fistful of his jerkin at his waist. She tried to steady herself, but her left hand, the one damaged nearly 3 years before by the arrow sent on her uncle's orders as she fled Babenberg, refused to press against the man's torso. She fumbled. Fire coursed over her back. The man had managed to twist Osrith's sword round and slice it into Osrith's back, tearing at the dress and scraping deeply. Osrith curled backwards, off the man as though he lay back, victory written over his features. He would not yield. He was the champion. Or so he thought. Making the gargling, wild battle cry of the Picts, a noise which had terrified even the savage Norse on the field that day so long ago, Osrith sent her left fist into her opponent's groin, grabbing at what was there and twisting with all her might. The man dropped her sword and Osrith rolled away, staggering to her feet, then swinging the sword aloft. He was easy prey now, and she aimed the sword towards the man's agony. But her blade met with another. Not the poor excuse of her opponent's sword, but one with some real weight behind its steel. She looked into a face she knew, one who had once been her opponent. Domhnall Mac watched Osrith drop her combat sword, and held her arm aloft. The victor, he declared, as pulses of blood irradiated across Osrith's shoulder and back. Now, by decree of the High King, the competition is over. In the twilight, applause circulated around from the spectators, but there were also some discontent that it was over and the royal prince had not opened up the challenge to anyone else against her. Instead, Domhnall led her off by the arm, walking quickly past the crowd and out around the canvaste, up towards the food tents. Around them, supply kinds of smells of venison, rabbit and pork wafted on the evening air. Domhnall then stopped, suddenly, and threw her in front of him. The champion of a sword contest, he summarized, and released Osrith's arm, thrusting her in front of him. With her good arm, Osrith reached for sword, but he pulled it out of her reach, a triumphant smirk on his face. I won, panted Osrith, protestingly as she tried again. Come and get it, Domhnall tormented, as guards began to surround him on all sides. Her features began to look fierce, but the fight was ebbing from her wounds demanding her body's attention. Osrith sighed, then turned to go. He obviously wanted to keep it from her, to keep it himself, perhaps. Guards! Domhnall raised his arm, addressing those who had surrounded them. Terrified, Osrith struggled as the 4 men closed in on her. You fought my guardsman, Domhnall growled, his eyes filling with anger as the guard's stale breath met her skin. Osrith's words of protest stuck in her throat. Then, suddenly, Domhnall lowered his arm and uttered, now. At once, the 4 guards each seized her by her limbs. Bryn is my warrior, you dishonor him, like dishonored Constantine. They dragged her to the back of the store's tent, one guard holding down each limb, pressing each limb onto the rain-parched earth. She struggled, but there were too many of them. So, you like to fight? he mocked, as Osrith refused to submit, and he bent to the tear at the shoulder of the dress which his warrior's blow had begun. Clammy hands reached out for her breasts, which closed around them, in turn. It is just a body, Osrith told herself. Do not submit your soul to him, do not submit to weak fear. It takes 5 of you to restrain me, Domhnall Mac Dhu Neil, she spat back, in defiance. His eyes narrowed, and he nodded at the guards who held her more firmly to the grass, small pebbles of sandstone pebble pressing into her back. You shamed my cousin. Fighting in his place, Domhnall continued, bending over her, then kneeling, put his hand between the tears in her dress skirt. So, we have come to an understanding. He pressed his fingers over the bumps between her legs, then pressed inwards, to a place only Constantine knew. When he is not humping you, you can hump me, or whoever I choose, and I will watch. Then, he groped himself, pulling his hand up and down his own cock. You are a whore, Constantine, he continued, getting more vigorous. It's just up and down, Osrith reminded herself, nothing more. But then a little thought suppressed that thought, and reminded her, that's not how you felt when Constantine ploughed you on the beach last night. And now, you will be a whore to me, Domhnall continued, getting breathless, while he worked himself hard, as she had chanced to do one night in the stables not long after they had arrived at Doia. But I am no whore, Osrith's mind protested. I do not do this for a few shillings. We are connected, Constantine and I, that is more than humping. And I have sworn I will never, she wanted to scream, and it will not happen again. Domhnall loomed over her in triumph, breeches around his ankles, the force in his cock straining against his hand. But, he was too slow. Osrith had felt the guards waver in their commitment to comply in the prince's impending violation of her body. It was enough. Kicking one leg free, she aimed her foot towards his scrotum. It was a bad shot for, as she extended her leg, the muscles in her back contracted and she caught his leg instead. Domhnall staggered away, fury on his face as the guards pressed her down even harder. But a voice, calm as a summer sea, settled over them all. Osrith recognized the voice. She had fled from it as he spoke about a girl, at the monastery in Ardmachir. She strained upwards, and her supposition was confirmed as her eye caught that of King Flan's eldest son. This is not the way a prince behaves, Don Chada chided. Osrith felt her limbs lighten as he added, you, go. He stood away from her, as Domhnall decorated the store's tent with his fluid. Who are you? Don Chada asked, standing away from her and allowing Osrith to get to her feet. I am. No one, Osrith breathed as she regained her footing. This is Osrith, servant of my cousin, our cousin Domhnall, Domhnall sneered. Osrith pulled her dress over her breasts, and tried to stand as tall as her injuries would allow. You don't treat servants like this, Domhnall, Prince Don Chada chided. I am a warrior. So you say, Domhnall spat at her, yet you betrayed Constantine by fighting in his stead, his whore. A frown crossed the southern Neil prince's face and he took her right arm and wrenched her towards him. Osrith just managed to curb her footing. Why, Akalin. He looked down at the outline of her breasts under the ruined cloth. She fought to cover them with her hands. Of course a girl. Am I Domhnall? He looked furiously at Don Chada, and then mockingly back at Osrith. An Anglian Northumbrian skivvy of Constantine when he was a boy, and is now his whore. Who won this from my servant in the sword battle? He showed his stepbrother the Frankish sword. This time Osrith did not miss. Domhnall got the full force of her foot in the sack. He reeled, grabbing at the tent cloth that he had just decorated with his semen, writhing in pain. Don Chada turned to Osrith and looked at her in disbelief. But you could only be. I'm 14, nearly, Osrith declared. Constantine requested I accompany him in his exile. She looked at the sword she had won. And yes, that's mine, I won it. But Don Chada's face clouded, and he thrust his hand forward, grabbing her plait, twisting around his hand, her scalp in agony. He drew Osrith's face to his own. You may think we Irish are fools, but we are not fooled by a girl, his words soft, steady. Don Chada nodded his head towards Domnall. You attached a noble, that is no way for a servant to behave. I am no servant. Osrith managed, her teeth gritted. I am a warrior. But Don Chard only HMPH'd as he began to drag her past the store's tent, Domnall leering derisively at her, wincing as he followed behind Don Charda. Beyond the canvas, fires burned, one heating a stew hung over it by thick chains, a woman tending the broth. She started when she saw Don Charda pulling Osrith by her hair, and retreated when he pulled her close to the fire. The flames danced before her eyes, her face growing dry and hot. By her side, Don Charda slid his sword from its scabbard. Osrith saw it flash in the firelight as he raised it. She braced herself for pain, by fire, by blade, but then felt her body releasing as the High King's firstborn son slicked through her braid, casting it into the fire before her eyes. He let her go. Without looking back to see her hair alight, Osrith scrambled to her feet, making for the warriors' camp on the other side of the ridge. Get dressed, Osrith told herself as she ran past Mia's household guard. Take your silver and go. You owe no one here your organs, no one your loyalty, obedience. Rounding the top of the ridge, and by a spinney of trees, fatigue came to her body and Osrith slumped down onto the ground. She had fought, and won, and for being a girl she had had her prize confiscated and, worse, her hair shorn close. If she were home, would she look like her father? Or Uhtred? Osrith closed her eyes. She might have not agreed to come with Constantine, find another way to be by her brother's side. Her hair was mutilated now, she was no longer a warrior. Was she really supposed to be a sister now, confined to baby naking as part of a trade agreement? Sighing at the thought of such a wretched fate, Osrith got to her feet, pounding them towards the warrior's tent, furious with herself. But the heat of her anger quelled when she saw Finoli, standing, arms folded and looking out from the canvas entrance, a brave of rabbit roasting over a small fire. His placid face filled with horror when he saw her, cut, bruised, torn. Who did this? He demanded, hand on his sword as he looked past Osrith, looking for her assailant. But she looked past him and into the corner of the tent to her clothes. He took her arm, and Osrith looked up to him, her friend and warrior practice opponent, who now put his hand over her face, looking at her wounds, then her shoulder, before hovering his hand over her back. Then, Finoli put his hand to her head, to her short stumps of pale golden hair. When she didn't answer, he prompted, Constantine? Domnall, she said bluntly. Don Chada, then added, as she recalled her fight, myself. Finoli pressed no more, but instead helped her down onto his own fur, taking out the koi ache from the pot, and began to bathe her and treat her wounds, starting with her back, listening as she let out pieces of the evening, her fight, her attack, anger growing, anger at herself. Finoli was helping her into her clothes as the canvas flap was pushed aside. Dadg and Fergus told me they saw you battle, Domnall declared. Finoli backed away from Osrith as their lord strode in. She put her arm across her chest but Domnall did not look away. Instead he appraised her back, shoulder and arms so she continued to dress. Then, his eyes caught sight of her hair, crudely hacked, tufts hanging about her head. I am ashamed, was all Domnall said, when Osrith stood before him as upright as her back would allow. Why, my lord? I wished to win a sword. Not that, Domnall, he growled. Osrith remained silent. It would cause further trouble and she sensed that the new rule of Flan Sinu under whose protection he and Constantine were now placed by default, was much different to Gatavd Findlaith's. You are to apologize. Why? What did he do that you kicked the boy in the ball bag? Osrith said nothing. So you aren't going to tell me? I can guess. He strode past Finoli then rounded back on Osrith. If you had been a man, you would have been put to trial, you could be put to death. Osrith, if you were a man, one of my warriors. If I were a man he would not have tried to force himself on me, for guards holding me down. I saw you there. Domnall shouted angrily. If you had wanted a sword that badly you should have asked. I could not, my lord. Osrith shot back, outraged. I lost my father's sword. It was incumbent of me to earn a new one. You fought Domhnall's servant. He rounded on her. I don't know what you did. Things are not as they are in Pitland. I am treading a very thin political line while Muir shelters Constantine and I. She saw him flash a look at Finoli as a measure of grim satisfaction caught in her mind. It wasn't just her imagination. She was right to believe things were changed. In the morning, I will take you before the High King. You will apologize for your actions and the shame you have brought. His face flickered, then he placed a hand on her shoulder. You may be whipped for this. It will depend on Flan's disposition, and he is not well disposed to girls who fight. He turned to go, then scowled at her. Rest, do not leave the tent even if Constantine does come looking for you, do not run away. Then, looking her up and down, he said, I do not think I have ever seen a duel fought with so much heart.